The Everglades were more than just a home to Nathan Nate Calloway. They were his entire world. He had grown up waiting for the sawgrass, setting traps for fish as a boy, and later hunting gators for a living. With a face weathered by the Florida sun and hands rough from years of handling ropes and knives, Nate was one of the last true swampmen. He lived alone in a stilted cabin deep in the marsh, miles from the nearest town, relying on his airboat and his instincts to survive. Gator hunting was in his blood. His father had done it, and his grandfather before him. The state had strict regulations, but permits allowed hunters like Nate to make a living capturing or killing nuisance alligators that grew too bold, working too close to people, taking pets, or in some cases attacking livestock. It was dangerous work, but it paid well if you knew what you were doing, and nobody knew the Everglades like Nate Calloway. One humid morning, as the mist still clung to the surface of the water, Nate set out in his airboat, pushing through the narrow channels where mangroves twisted together like gnarled fingers. He had heard rumors of a monster, an alligator so massive it had become a legend among the other hunters. The locals called it Old Scar because of the deep, jagged mark running across its snout, likely from a battle long ago. Some said it was over 15 feet long, an ancient beast that had eluded capture for decades. Nate didn't put much stock in legends. Every gator was a gator, and any of them could be dangerous. But when a local cattle rancher offered a hefty bounty for the creature, claiming it had been dragging full-grown calves into the water, Nate decided it was worth checking out. He spent the next 3 days tracking the beast. He found deep claw marks in the mud along the banks of a secluded lagoon, massive slide trails leading into the water, and even the half-eaten remains of a wild boar. This gator was big. That much was certain, but it was also smart. Every time Nate got close, Old Scar seemed to vanish into the murky depths, avoiding his traps like it knew exactly what was coming. On the 4th day, Nate decided to try something different. He set up near a bend in the river, where the water was deep and still, perfect for a big gator to lay low. Using a whole chicken carcass as bait, he rigged a heavy-duty snare and waited. The sun sank lower, turning the sky a fiery orange. Mosquitoes buzzed around him, but he barely noticed. He had patience. He had time. Then, just as the last light of day faded, the water rippled. A slow, deliberate movement. Nate tensed. He could see the gator now, massive, dark, gliding just beneath the surface like a shadow. He had never seen one this big before. Old Scar moved with an eerie stillness, barely disturbing the water. Then, in a flash, the gator lunged. Its massive jaws clamped onto the bait, thrashing wildly. Nate pulled the snare, the thick rope tightening around the beast's muscular neck. But the gator was too powerful. Instead of being yanked toward the boat, it surged forward, nearly pulling Nate overboard. Son of a... Nate gritted his teeth, wrapping the rope around his wrist as he fought to keep his footing. The airboat rocked violently as Old Scar thrashed, tail whipping the surface and sending water spraying into the air. Nate struggled, muscles straining against the raw power of the beast. He reached for his harpoon, knowing he had to weaken it before it snapped the rope or flipped the boat. But Old Scar wasn't just fighting, he was thinking. With a sudden twist, the gator dove deep, pulling the rope down with him. Nate barely had time to react before the line yanked tight, dragging him forward. He slammed against the edge of the boat, feeling the sharp sting of the impact in his ribs. He knew he had 2 choices: let go of the rope and lose the gator, or hold on and risk being pulled under. Nate wasn't about to let go. With a surge of effort, he braced his legs and held on. Old Scar twisted again, but this time, Nate was ready. He used the creature's own momentum to pull himself upright, grabbing his harpoon. As the gator surfaced for a breath, Nate struck, plunging the harpoon deep into his thick hide just behind the head. The gator bellowed, the deep guttural sound vibrating through Nate's chest. It twisted violently, nearly capsizing the boat, but the harpoon was in. Nate grabbed his rifle next, taking quick aim. 1 shot. That was all he needed. Old Scar lunged again, jaws snapping inches from the side of the boat. Nate fired. The shot rang out across the swamp. The gator convulsed, its massive body thrashing in a final, desperate attempt to fight. Then slowly it stilled. The water settled. The night was silent. Nate sat back, breathing heavily, muscles burning from the struggle. He had done it. Old Scar, the legend of the Everglades, was his. Getting the beast back to shore was another ordeal. Even with the winch on his airboat, it took nearly an hour to haul the massive reptile onto a sandbar. When he finally got a good look, he whistled low. Old Scar was even bigger than he'd thought, 17 feet, maybe more, a true monster. By the time he made it back to town, word had already spread. People gathered at the docks, gawking at the sheer size of the gator. The rancher who had offered the bounty shook Nate's hand and handed over a check that was more money than he had seen in years. Hell of a catch, one of the other hunters said, shaking his head in amazement. That thing's been out there longer than any of us. Nate just nodded. He wasn't one for boasting. The swamp had given him a challenge, and he had risen to meet it. That was enough. That night, as he sat on the porch of his stilted cabin, drinking a cold beer and listening to the distant sounds of the Everglades, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: satisfaction. He had bested the biggest gator in the swamp, earned his payday, and secured his place in local legend. But as he looked out over the dark waters, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the vast untamed wilderness of the Everglades, another monster was waiting. And if there was one thing Nate Calloway knew for sure, it was that the swamp always had another challenge in store. Thank you for joining us for Fireside Stories. If you like this story and want more just like them, remember before you leave to subscribe and hit the like button. And we'll see you next time that we all gather around the fire.